All right. Well,
You see, do I have permission to share screen when after you're done with introductions?
yeah, absolutely. Let me just do that real quick now. Participants, Megan, I think everybody should, but I'm going to make
disabled participant screen sharing.
Yeah, I'm going to fix that real quick. All participants. Okay, it should be fixed now, and I made you a co-host. Thank you all, the four of you, for coming, and for anybody that's watching this, I really appreciate it. This is the first of a series of workshops that we're going to try to do before the spring semester gets too deep, to help coaches, especially newer coaches, get their feet wet with forensics events. And I'm super excited that Dr. Megan Hagaman, who is my good friend and somebody I've worked closely with in a number of capacities over the last few years, is kicking this thing off. I think it's only appropriate that Megan gets a chance to kick it off, because she's just one of my favorite human beings, but more importantly, she's probably like the best extemp coach that I've ever got a chance to watch. And I know, in addition to her successes, which I'll let her talk about, I don't know if she'd talk about this or not, but I know that she had her hands in coaching some really deep Kansas kids in extemp at nationals last year for Lawrence Free State. And I want you to tell everybody about that if you weren't going to. And anyway, I'm going to shut up and I'm going to turn things over to Megan. But thank you, Megan, and thank you all for joining us tonight.
Yeah, so just a little bit about me. I am a Kansas born and bred debate and forensics person. I grew up in Abilene, which is 20 minutes down the road from where I'm at now in Salina. I currently coach at Salina South and have been there for the last 6 years. Prior to that, I had a short stint at Abilene High School and a long stint at El Dorado High School. I've coached numerous state champions in extemporaneous speaking in foreign and in domestic. And had numerous out-round participants in different national tournaments, most particularly in extemp. That's one of the areas that we tend to be very strong in and have students in. I was lucky last year that Mr. Thompson at Lawrence Free State contacted me when his student made it deep into out-rounds, and I got to talk with that young man a little bit and help prep him for national style extemp and a little bit of the stylistic things to expect when you're competing at those larger tournaments. So that was really exciting for me, and I was happy that they let me be included in that conversation. So I think I'm going to start with, I have a bunch of different presentations, but since we have a younger group here, I think I'm going to start with the guide that I give my students for extemp. And I kind of do things differently. I have a portfolio for each of the events that I do. And then I have students get an introduction to the event. And I'm going to talk a little bit about what the event is and what it looks like. And then I'll talk about how I set up coaching sessions for students. And we can talk about different options for file keeping for extemp. I have a bunch of resources. I am happy to share those with anybody too who wants to contact me for them. I think one thing that's great about the forensics community is we all share a lot. And most coaches take what other coaches have used and they make it their own and find ways to incorporate it into their curriculum. So the beginning of this, if anyone is familiar with extemp, will be a little bit of review. So just kind of the rules for extemp. The speeches can't be pre-prepared, so we don't do canned speeches. Some students will have like lists of examples that they might use for attention getting devices or some things that they consult regularly for that, and that's perfectly fine. But the speeches aren't to be pre-written or speeches that are saved in files that they pull. They have to be originally created by the speaker during the preparation period. Obviously, extemp comes in two flavors, international or in United States extemp. And I know that if you are a classification 4A down, you're just going to have extemp, and students are going to have an envelope for each category at a tournament, and they're going to pick whichever envelope they want. And they can do United States extemp one round, and then they can do international extemp the next round. Some of the questions tend to overlap at times. A lot of the international questions might have some United States elements to them or talk about foreign policy in the United States, but the real difference is we're looking for the analysis of how elections, rules, regulations, technology, environmental policy is impacting us in the United States versus in other countries as well, and how we interact with that. So in Extemp, there's typically a prep room. Students go to that prep room, and if they are 5A or 6A, they're going to have either International Extemp or United States Extemp assigned as the event. If they're 4A down, they'll just have those 2 envelopes and they can choose. They'll draw those 3 questions. Questions are typically phrased as yes or no answers, although there are more advanced Extemp questions that take a little bit more nuance that are not yes or no, and that require individuals to have a little bit more knowledge. So they will, and we'll talk about how we break down the preparation period for the 30 minutes of prep that students get here in a little bit. So they'll pick which question they are the most familiar with, and then they'll consult a pre-filed filing system. Now, this is something else that I think is changing a little bit, because in the past, we used to print articles off and highlight them and then put them in a giant file box and tote that around. And then debate and forensics evolved a little bit. And, you know, people started using Dropbox, Evernote, some other resources. And then there were some resources created that you can purchase that act as Extemp files for you. And I think this year might be the first year I don't purchase an Extemp filing system, because KSHA has opened up the ability of students to use the internet. There really might not be a reason to purchase a system. And we can talk about that a little bit later as well. But they'll consert those articles and files. They have 30 minutes to put together their argument as to why the question is to be answered in affirmation or in negation. And then they go deliver a 7-minute speech. Now, it says on here that speakers are not allowed to consult notes during the speech. If you are in the state of Kansas and you're just competing at state, the rules do say students may use a note card. I don't even tell my students that's an option, because we live in a world where we're not only 5A, but we also compete at nationals, and at nationals, no notes can be consulted during the speech. So I don't train my students to ever have that note card as a crutch or to use it, just because it's going to be so hard for them to transition off of it. But if you are just competing at state in Kansas and they want to use a note card, that's okay. And depending on the classification, I was 4A for a very, very long time before I moved up to 5A. And I would say maybe 25% of the extempers used a note card. A lot of them did not. And I think that it's pretty impressive if students can recall information, cite their sources, have a strong organized speech that sounds like it was a prepared speech without using that note card. And it certainly sets them apart from other students who do use the note card. So that's kind of what the event looks like. And so this is what I tell my students about files. So I tell them they're going to be required to file. And in the last few years, we have purchased, we've had Extemp Genie, which is a free source, but we've also used, Extemp Engine, which is a free source. And then Extemp Genie we have purchased for our students. And it pulls a bunch of articles that they can then sort into files, and they can read them and highlight them. I do have a video on setting up a filing system, and I have a sheet that I'd be happy to share that has all of the different options for filing for Extemp. I think the biggest thing about Extemp, especially in a world in which students can just Google once they get the question, is that students just need to be well read. They need to read the news a little bit every day and have an idea of what's going on in the world. So just picking some good sources that they can read and they know what's happening, and sources that they can go to, that should be what they should be doing. And I do get a quiz that I put together over recent events that are happening in the world, and I send that out to my extempers each week, and they take that quiz. And then we also do a lot of practice where I'll send them questions, and then we will go pull all of the articles that we would use to answer that question. And we will script out the speech, but we might not actually give it. And we might just sit down and talk about what the sources they found were, how they decided to answer the question, and then we'll look at their analysis, because that's really important. And we'll talk about how to structure that a little bit later. So we talk about filing every day, getting at least 6 articles from a variety of media sources on generalized topics every day. We do a weekly news quiz. And then we also try to pre-write some potential attention-getting device topics. So whatever you want to start off with in Extemp for your introduction, you really kind of want to work on some of those ahead of time, because Extemp is so driven by the news and current events and sometimes really seemingly like nerdy areas. It's important to add a little bit of humor to it and to try to find ways to incorporate that. And the attention-getting device and the driver that you use for the presentation is really one way where you can kind of take advantage of that and add some humor in that will help the judge like enjoy the speech more. So when we are prepping, these are kind of the guidelines that I go over with my students. So you have that 30-minute time, you have a scheduled draw time that you show up to pick your topics. We spend 1 minute picking our topic, draw the topics, read them. We make an analysis of whether or not we understand the topic. If we have information on it, would I be able to answer it? Can I outline that topic well? It's not always helpful to pick the easiest option, because you want to pick a topic that's going to help maximize how smart you look and how smart you appear to the judge. One thing I would caution on that though, and I've heard horror stories of extempers who pick a topic that they don't know anything about, or they think that they can pick this topic that they are not super familiar with and that it will be impressive when they can answer it. And then they don't have anything in the files. And then they're really talking about things they don't know. And if you get a judge who does know, then you're going to be in a world of hurt. So I always tell my students, don't pick topics that you have zero knowledge of. Picking a topic that you have a little bit of knowledge of that's an easier topic is a better option than picking one that you don't know anything about. You also want to try to stay away from super politically contentious issues or issues that are really heavily one-sided. You want to be able to look at analysis from both sides, because you don't know who your judge is, and you don't know what their political underlyings are, and you don't want to pick an issue or topic that's going to force a judge to listen to a speech that is completely opposed to anything that they believe in. And then just kind of analyzing whether or not you think the topic might be a good choice for the judge. So that's 1 minute is picking the topic and getting that ready to go. So then the next little bit is 10 minutes of researching and drafting your speech. So, and I know that it's 30 minutes, and beginning extempers make the mistake of using that whole 30 minutes to try to write out a whole speech. And that's really setting yourself up for failure, because you're not going to remember a lot of the stuff you wrote down and you don't have any time to practice it ahead of time. So we really want to work on 10 minutes researching and drafting that speech, and really keeping it as close to that 10 minutes as possible. So we always check our filing system. Now, obviously, in the world, you can kind of Google and find more evidence on that, and then write an outline of your main points. It doesn't have to be super specific. And I'll show you, I have 2 written out extemp outlines for what they should look like. One of them has an explanation for each of the parts, and the other one's a blank one. And when I have novices start, I give them that to prep. So if they have no experience with extemp, one thing that is really important in extemp is just the muscle memory of organizing a speech in a particular fashion. So all extemp speeches that are successful kind of fit a formula. They have an introduction that has the same elements. They have 2 or 3 main body points that are all structured in the same fashion, and they have a conclusion that has the same elements. And so getting that down to where you can incorporate those elements every time you give the speech just makes it a lot easier for students, and it becomes muscle memory. So they know that they have to answer the question and incorporate those parts. And we're going to talk about what those are here in a little bit. So write out the outline of the main points, kind of do like a keyword outline, And then this is similar to what we would call warranting cards in debate, just talking about what we have read and not trying to directly quote what we've read, and not trying to word for word write out everything in the speech. So we've now spent a minute picking our question. As we walked back to our table, we figured out whether we're going to answer it yes or no. And then we've spent 10 minutes researching and then drafting a keyword outline for what we're going to include in our speech. And we will utilize sources throughout that. And we can kind of talk about some ways to make remembering sources a little bit easier, because average extempers will quote about 4 to 5 sources in an extemp speech. Good extempers will do 6 to 8, and great extempers will have 9 or more sources in their speech. And that's a lot to remember when you only have 30 minutes. So where those sources came from and what the dates are. So that's just kind of a guideline for researching and drafting. So then let's talk about what your intro should look like. So these are kind of the parts of an introduction. We always have an attention grabber, and that can be a story. It can be some background on the topic or the situation. Most people try to have some humor incorporated here. And so it's less likely. Beginning extempers will sometimes use quotations a lot as a crutch. And that's, I think, fine for beginning extempers. But once you get more advanced in extemp, you really kind of want to avoid quotations. And I have a list of areas where you can find good attention grabbers. And I would be happy to share that. And it's definitely available to anyone that needs that as well. So there are a lot of places. We have some books that I have that kids can kind of consult, like Weird History or Unknown History. And so students can find something that's similar to the story. I've had some students that are really into sports. I had someone that always used stories about Peyton Manning as an attention getting device, and had different themes that they could tie to whatever the topic was. And they could add a little bit of humor that way. So there are a lot of places where you can kind of look to get that information and come up with something. After you've given that attention grabber, you have to have a tie to the topic. So how did that attention getter bring us to the topic that we're going to be discussing? So how does the story or the quotation or the example relate to the topic? And you typically want to have a citation at this point that gives us a reason why the topic is important and how we got to the topic. It is a trend for people to cite books too on the national circuit and not just articles. That's a little bit more advanced. So obviously, if you have a student that's going to be competing at nationals, there are some good books that they can pick up to read that are pretty universal and effective to be able to cite in a lot of situations. So we have our attention grabber. We have tied our attention grabber to the topic and given some source support. And then we have a statement of significance, which is kind of why the topic merits our consideration. Why is it important to answer it and analyze it? After that, we state the question and we give a clear answer to the question. So if you're at nationals, especially in the final rounds, a lot of times the questions aren't yes or no. They might be what should be the first priority of the new House of Representatives post the midterm elections. And then you have to pick something that they should focus on and be able to give us support as to why that needs to be their first area of focus. But most of the time, especially just at tournaments around Kansas, it's going to be yes or no questions. And you have to pick a side. Don't be wishy-washy in the middle and say, well, a little bit yes and a little bit no. You have to pick a side. And then after you have answered the question, you're going to preview those 3 main points of your speech. Use words first, second, third. One thing I would mention here, and it's not written on this slide, those taglines for what your 3 arguments are going to be need to be 5 to 7 words or fewer. You need to make it short and kind of catchy so that the judge can write those down and the judge can remember what those arguments are. So that makes it easier on the people that are listening to your speech to know what your 3 main arguments are going to be, and it makes it easier for you to remember them and to restate them as you go throughout the speech. Because a lot of extemp is repetition of the areas that we've chosen and making sure we have that internal and external structure. So then when we look at the main body point, there are two different ways we can organize information. Most people do a 3x1. So we're going to have 3 main points with 1 example and how that example supports those points. College style and more advanced extempors sometimes might want to do a 2x2, where you have 1 topic and then 2 supporting examples that you can explain how those areas support that topic. That's a little bit more advanced and a little bit more nuanced and takes a little bit more thinking, because you have to find clearly delineated examples that support the area that you're talking about. Like I said, most people will default to a 3x1. They'll have 3 main examples as to why the question is true or false, and then they will explain those examples and lead to a conclusion that supports the point. So this is kind of a breakdown of the 3x1 structure. So if I'm going to have my first main point, which is going to be 1 reason why my answer is correct on the topic. And I'm typically going to always try to have 2 citations in that body point. And I'm going to give 1 major example or instance that supports my claim. And I will talk about how those examples are kind of formulated here in a little bit too, because there's a specific structure for those. And then I'll do a second main point and have the same thing. I'll give a clear example with a couple of citations, and I will give some reasoning or analysis as to why that's true. And I'll do the third thing on the same main point. So I'm going to have at least 6 citations in the body of my speech and 1 citation in my introduction if I use a 3x1 structure for 7 citations. And that sets me up to be in a pretty good support situation for my speech. If I'm doing the 2x2 structure, I'm going to have the first main point, and then I'm going to have 2 separate support sets. So I'm going to have a claim with a major example or instance, 1 or 2 citations, and then I'm going to have warrants or impacts that explain why this connects to the question and why it matters. And then I'm going to do the same thing for my second supporting set. And then I'll have a second main point that also follows that structure. And these structures I've also typed up on a separate document, which I'm happy to share, that talks about how those are formulated and how to put them together. And like I said, every extemp speech is going to be structured in the same way. And so you're always going to have an intro that has the same parts, body that is organized in the same fashion, and conclusion in the same organizational pattern. And so it's just muscle memory. The more students perform, the more students try to give those speeches, the easier it is to make sure that you're following that form and that you have a really clearly organized speech. So let's talk a little bit about what a set is. So for all of those examples, I said you need a set. A set includes a claim. That's a statement that we make of a fact that we are trying to support. And then we give evidence for that claim. And that directly supports the claim that we made. And this again restates that for a 3x1, you want to have 2 citations. And for a 2x2, you need 1 to 2 citations per supporting example. And then the last thing I have is reasoning or an explanation. That's how we teach argument in my building. We teach it in our English classes, our science classes, all across the curriculum, that an argument has claim, evidence, and reasoning. And so that's the language that I use here as well. But this is the same thing as warranting out the evidence at the end. So you're going to use your own words to explain how the evidence and the claim that you made tie back to the question and prove your analysis to be correct. This should be where you put a lot of emphasis on the point in extemp, because you should have more than a couple sentences that explain not only how the evidence supports the claim, but how it ties back to the question, because we always want to draw the judge's attention back to the fact that we're answering the question and we're supporting our answer. And then good conclusions look a lot like good introductions. They're just in reverse. So whenever we transition back into the conclusion, we're going to say something similar to, so today when we turn our attention back to the question at hand, and then we're going to restate the question, and then we're going to restate the answer that we gave, so that we can remind the judge what we talked about and which direction we went with the question. Then we're going to restate the 3 reasons we gave for our answer, and we're going to review that. And then we want to tie back to our opening story. That's what we call an outro. We want to come to a conclusion, put a bow on the package and tie it up and bring everything together so that we've created one universal, cohesive story throughout the whole speech. Advanced extempers will not only use the story that they tell at the beginning of the speech, at the end, they'll also use it as their transitions in between main points. So beginning extempers, if they just start out saying, first, we're going to talk about this, that's a win, because they're having transitions that are clear and we can get them from point to point. Advanced extempers want to use thematic transitions that relate to the story they told at the beginning. So that gets us through, everything's written out. We've prepared our speech. We've done our first 12 minutes of prep to 15 minutes of prep. And the last 15 to 20 minutes we want to spend rehearsing. And, you know, we said earlier that beginning speakers are going to spend a lot more time trying to write the speech out and be very concerned about memorizing or trying to recall stuff. But you really want to have time to practice. So you want to get up, find a place where you can talk to a wall and say your speech out loud. The goal is you should be revising that speech, making adjustments, because it's extemporaneous. It's never going to be word for word what you wrote down, but you still want to have the same ideas throughout and know what your main points are and have knowledge of what your sources are in your head, so that when you go to your room, you're going to be ready to do that and ready to revise your speech. You don't want to waste a lot of time. So you want to make sure that you're really effective and efficient during your prep time, and that you're using every minute that you have to revise, to practice, to rehearse. And then you want to save about 2 minutes at the end of that to walk to your room. You want to be there waiting when the judge opens the door or the last competitor walks out. The judge shouldn't have to wait on you to show up and extend. And when you're walking there, practice your speech the whole time. When you get there, if the prior competitor is still speaking, use that time to practice again in the hallway. Just find a wall and talk to it. Never waste an opportunity to refine the speech, because you have a lot to remember and a lot of analysis to give. The more you practice, the better off you're going to be. And that's really how Extemp works and how it functions, and how we've got it put together, and how the preparation process should work for people that are competing in Extemp. One thing I will say, like, Extemp is definitely not for every student. If your school has a debate team, Extemp is typically a great way for debaters to refine speaking skills, also for them to practice impacting out arguments and analyzing evidence and putting that together. So a lot of my debaters will do Extemp. And I do have a couple of students that aren't debaters that also do Extemp, because they are kind of news junkies and are into that. And I give my students at the beginning of the season, there are a couple of things I do. I have them, I actually stole this from another coach years ago. I have them tell me their story, and they get one note card and they write on one side anything that they think I might need to know to understand where they're coming from, anything I might need to be sensitive about, anything that they're really have that is unique or interesting that they have had as an experience throughout their lives. And then I also have them fill out a questionnaire where I ask them very specific questions. And some of those questions are pretty obviously geared towards finding out if they would be good at an event. So I want to know things like, do you enjoy current events? You know, what kind of news do you consume, if any? So I ask a lot of questions like that, because the students who can answer those questions in affirmation are probably the students I want to do Extemp, because they're going to enjoy it. So just some tips that I give to my students, like, Extemp is hard. It's kind of the special forces. And so you have to be really confident and kind of fake it until you become it. So the students that tend to win an Extemp are the ones that are confident speakers, and they really let the judge know that they know what they're talking about. Their speech sounds really fluid. And it almost sounds like a prepared speech. If you watch extemp videos on YouTube or on an SDA or on the AFA website, which is the collegiate level extemp, those speakers sound like they wrote the speech ahead of time. So they don't sound like they're getting up off the cuff and just, giving a speech that they only had 30 minutes to prepare for. So working on that fluidity and working on pretending that you really were prepared for this, and this is a question that you knew a lot about, is really important. Also, I tell my students to explain stuff to the judge. You want to be smart, but not so smart that you talk over people's heads. You also don't want to assume people are dumb, so you don't want to water it down too much. It's kind of a fine balance. You want to make sure that you are talking at a level that's accessible to whoever is listening in the back of the room. And so you definitely want to be smart, but at the same time, you have to explain things a little bit. But don't ever insult someone's intelligence or assume that they don't know what you're talking about. And then the other thing that's important as extemp is finding a way to incorporate humor, because extemp is a little bit boring sometimes. And listening to really boring extemp speeches can really be torturous sometimes as a judge. So it's nice to have competitors that can use some humor, even if it's awkward and the student's not naturally funny. That helps add an element of entertainment, and that helps students really kind of stand out. Some of my best extempers were really good at just making fun of themselves. And so they would have funny stories about things that had occurred in their childhood, or have funny things that they've read, and they would use those to kind of tie in and make it about themselves. If you get to watch Tim Huffman's speech from this year, he kind of makes fun of himself for not being as athletic as the rest of his family at the beginning, but finding his niche in speech and debate. And so that's kind of neat because it personalizes the speech a little bit and lets the judge get to know you a little bit, but then also adds a little bit of humor that helps make the speech more interesting. So when we do coaching sessions to start, we're going to practice a full extemp speech from start to finish. I give students 3 questions, and then they should make sure they arrive 30 minutes before the scheduled coaching time so that we can more efficiently utilize. I will often have my extempers preparing while I'm working with someone else, so that as soon as they're done, I'm ready to focus on them. I look at their verbal and their nonverbal delivery, because a lot of times what they're doing with their body is just as important as what they're saying with their mouth. And so we work on that. And I always have them bring a writing utensil or a sheet that they use to outline their notes so that they can take lots of notes about it. And I always want to look at their analysis. So we talked earlier about sometimes in class, if I don't have time to listen to the speech, I might just have them go pull research and outline a speech. And then sometimes I'll have them switch and do the opposite answer as well, so that they have to think on both sides of the fence. Because most of these questions can be easily answered in either direction, depending on the research that they pull. And so we do a lot of that. Your advanced extempers, one thing that I think is important to do, and we did this a lot last year with my USX state champion. She was just so coachable and she wanted to work all of the time. And one thing we did to help improve her preparation was she only got 15 minutes and then had to stand and deliver a speech. And we just did that and did that and did that until she could prepare a speech so quickly and get up and give it. It was just second nature. And so there are a lot of little things that you can work on, and a little techniques that you can kind of tweak and adjust. You can do stop and starts when they're speaking, have them go back and restart, redo the introduction, fix things as you go. But we focus on a lot of those things, and just kind of depending on the needs of the student. Beginning extempers have a really hard time filling 7 minutes. It's really intimidating, especially if they're not using a note card and they're just going off of what they do. So the more they practice it, the more they kind of see it, the more they get into that rhythm and it becomes second nature. So I always tell my kids they need to be a VIP. And this is dealing with verbal delivery. So we work on volume. They need to be heard by the judge and have an appropriate volume for the room. Intonation. A lot of extempers are really boring. So putting some kind of life or energy into your voice, making yourself more likable and more engaging. Sounding passionate about whatever topic you're talking about, that's really important. And that helps support your speaking and get more feedback from the judge. And then personality. You've really got to have a lot of extent personality because it's so drawn towards like logical, analytical individuals who like news and who like to analyze politics. You really got to work on developing a personality. So you should treat it like it's an interpretant and create a great character that you use when you speak that's more engaging. So that's really important. And it's hard to develop that likability sometimes, but if you can really treat it like it's more of an interpretant where you're a persona that you're delivering your speech in so that you're more engaging, that's going to help as well. So nonverbal delivery, things that we talk about, feet should be shoulder width apart. You want to avoid rocking or shifting your weight from hip to hip and having antsy feet. We want to stand firm in one location. Our posture, we want to stand straight and tall. We tend to perceive people who have solid posture as more knowledgeable and more credible than those who don't. I had an extemper that leaned forward. It was very awkward for a very long time, and it was hard to work on getting them to stand up straight and tall, and they always got comments about that. So we work on posture as well. And gestures are really important. A lot of extempers are terrible at gestures. They don't know what to do with their hands. So they either cross themselves off or leave them hanging at the sides too long and don't use them to emphasize. I typically tell people that they use 3 types of gestures. The give, which is we're giving information, we're using our palms up, can be one-handed or two-handed. The show, which is a unique gesture that kind of matches whatever you're saying. So if we're saying prices are rising, we might want to gesture up so that we match that. I once watched a video that said the most effective hand gestures look like natural things that we're doing. So we should open the door. We should take the lid off the jar of peanut butter. And just things like that that make them look like unique gestures that are natural that we would do normally. And then the chop, which is emphasizing points. You can do that if you have a strong point or a strong opinion. So those are kind of the gestures that we do. We plan, we incorporate some gestures into the movement that we use from point to point, just so that students know or have an idea what they should do with their hands. And then we practice that a lot, because really extempers and their gestures a lot of times are really terrible. And then nonverbal delivery items to kind of focus on for extemp. Use your face a lot as a tool, because the judge is looking at your face 90% of the time. And so some tones that you're humorous or lighthearted, eyebrows are up, you have a smile, you look like you're enjoying the speech. If you're serious, your eyebrows are down, your face is more tight, you have more gravity in your voice, more pathos. And eyes are really the biggest area for the judge. So give the judge eye contact. It looks like you're prepared and you're honest. If you are lacking eye contact or looking down or looking off to the side a lot, it really looks like you're not confident and you're not prepared for the speech. So we talk about not only what we do with our body and how we take inventory of that, but also what we're doing with our face and our nonverbal delivery there, because that's all very important. This is kind of what we call the speaker's triangle, and I have it kind of lined out here. There are a lot of variations of this, just some things to keep in mind. You want to move from point to point, and you never want to walk away from your judge or from your audience. So you always want to walk towards them as though you're engaging them and including them. So we try to start towards the back center of the room where we can focus on the judge. And then we try to include the whole room and use the whole space that we have available. So we'll walk when we move to our first main body point, and then we will walk when we move to our third main body point, and our second main body point, and then our conclusion. So all of those things, we're walking and talking. We're talking while we're doing transitions, and there are a lot of different variations on this, but the main thing here is transitioning and moving. Every point that you have gives the judge an indication that you are moving on and analyzing a new area, and that helps support your speech and add some interest to it. So we talk about that and work on moving to those points. It also helps you as the speaker stay organized and on track of where you're at. So it's important to incorporate that movement. These are some revision and rehearsal kind of tips. The number one secret to doing well in Extemp or any event is just you, the work and the effort that you put into it. So the more you practice Extemp, the more you're reading every day, the more you know what's going on in the world, the better off you're going to be. So doing practice speeches, looking at questions, trying to determine if you have an idea of what's going on, that's really going to be helpful in developing your style as an extemper. We always should analyze what we get on ballots at the end of every tournament. So I know a lot of coaches that have a ballot critique sheet where students analyze that, and we do that as well. So we look at things that the judges complimented us on. We looked at things that the judges said were weaknesses or deficiencies that we need to improve. And then we set competition goals, and we also outline how much work we did before the tournament and what our results were at that tournament. So that way, when I sit down with that student before the next practice session, I can say, okay, so last week we didn't work very hard on this. So our goals for this week are making sure that we practice at least twice, slowing down our delivery, having clear transitions, or whatever it might be. And then those are the things that I'm going to look for when I'm doing critiques of the student's performance. Also, I just tend to open a Google Doc now and share that Google Doc with the student. And I type all of my notes and everything that I'm looking for on that Google Doc, and then they can have that, and we can keep a running record of what we worked on each week. And they can always pull that up and go over what critiques happened as we went throughout the semester. Also, redo your speeches. So if you missed getting to finals because you had one round that was weak, take that question, take 15 minutes, rewrite it, and then redeliver that and see if you can improve the things that were weak on that, so that we can find ways to improve on questions, because we might get that same question the next week. We might not ever get it again. But I know I've had students last year, we got a lot of repetitious questions throughout the season. And so we always wanted to find ways to make that better and to improve our knowledge on that, and to find better ways to explain current events to judges of all different levels and all different styles. Okay, so I think we can kind of pause and take any questions right now that you might have just about that basic stuff. Like I said, this is the beginning. So when I have students come in forensics, we do a basic introduction to events, and I kind of break it down into limited preparation events, which Extemp is, and then platform speeches, and then interp and acting events, and cover those. Then we do their questionnaire and their interest inventory. And then I have a meeting with every student, and we talk about what events would be a good fit for them. And then after they've chosen their events, they get access to the Extemp file. And so they would go over notes on what Extemp looks like. I would have them evaluate some sample Extemp speeches, and then they take notes on this presentation so that they know what to expect when I am going to see them at practices and what they should be doing for work. And then they have a portfolio that they keep all of their work, all of their ballots, all of their comments, and everything that we work on throughout the season. And then, like I said, weekly news quizzes, and working on filing. So any questions that anyone has right now at this time? I know it feels like a lot.
All right. Oh, I'm going to be quiet.
No, go ahead, Mike, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say that, like, to be honest, I give this lecture that I stole from Megan like 6 years ago now. And it's really cool to get to hear her give it, because I've actually never heard her give this lecture. And I've heard myself give it, and I've read it, but like incredibly cool perspective. And I mean, I guess here's my question, Megan.
Okay.
And we can look at all these details. What's the easiest way to get a kid excited and engaged to start off classroom activities for extemporaneous? Because I know, like at Southeast more than ever, I'm starting a new program with kids who have no, they can't spell extemp this year. Not extemporaneous, extemp. Like that's where we're at. How do I get them excited? Because I can't start here. I tried it in debate and it didn't work. What do you suggest?
So the thing that I think people make a lot of mistakes with extemp is, a lot of coaches are not, into the debate element, or maybe you don't have a debate program. And so when we introduce these events, a lot of times we speak from a place where this isn't our specialty, because maybe we are better at writing platform speeches, or maybe we're more into the theatrical side of forensics. And so when we talk about the limited prep events, we kind of brush over them. When I talk about events, it's kind of funny. The kids laugh at me. I was just introducing them in my novice debate classes this year, but every event I say, this is my favorite event. And so I think you have to be really excited about the event, because if you talk derogatorily about it, or you're just like, hey, there's this event, it's really nerdy, it's kind of boring, kids are going to be less excited about it and less likely to try it. I also really encourage students that when I look at that questionnaire, if they say they're into listening to the news, reading the news, because not every student is going to be good at extemp, and not every student is going to enjoy it. So my debaters, I try to encourage them to try it, but some of them, it maybe won't be their thing, but I want them to try it at least. But we do a lot of, I think that not selling it as, a really boring, nerdy event, you have to be excited about it. I have some students that are really successful at extemp that really love it, that also talk really positively about it and are willing to give practice speeches, are willing to share examples of attention getters that they use and how they kind of hook that into the judges. And they talk about it in a way as though, it's really cool to be able to adapt and to change. You don't get locked into one speech the whole season. You're constantly learning and growing and kind of editing. I was trying to think of games that we play that are specific to extemp. And we don't have, I think, any specific things other than here's this question, how would you answer it? Or doing shorter periods and trials of work, reading, looking at stuff, discussing, having engaging discussions about things that are going on in the world. You just got to get some kids that are excited about it, and it takes time. So I know that I was kind of lucky in the situation when I came to South, because there were a lot of kids who were pretty okay at extemp. And so I was able to work with that group and get them excited about it. One thing that I used to do when I taught at El Dorado, and I didn't have a lot of extempers, and the only children that I did have were really into IDA, which that's fantastic. I love that, but I want kids that are good at all elements and all events. So I had a room behind my desk that I called Extemp Land, and I would bake brownies and hide them in there. And so when kids were in filing, they could have a brownie. I tried to treat them like they were a little bit special, because they had to do more work than some of the other students, and their work is study throughout the semester. So they got their own room, their own space. It was called Extemp Land. It was treated like special. And then I would sometimes get them treats or give them some incentive to try to want to do extemp and to stick with it. Any other questions or things that you might want to know?
Thank you. That's perfect.
Yeah.
And I know all those things, but it's still perfect to hear them and get refreshed on all of it.
Yeah. And I've got a whole lot of stuff. Like I said, this is a typed version of the layout for an introduction. And I also wrote about how long each part of the speech should take. So that's kind of broken out. I also have the document, and I can also share these with Mr. Harris. I think he has a lot of them already. This is my blank extemp outline that I give my novices. So the very first couple of times that they are giving speeches, I give them this to script it out from, so that they know here are all the pieces, here are all the parts, and they can fill this out, and they practice with this until they don't need the outline anymore. And so that's one tool that I use a lot. I also have this document, and I haven't looked at it recently, but it's options for paperless extemp file keeping. So the first options are free. They're nested files that use no program. I've got basic instructions, advantages and disadvantages for those. I also talk about Dropbox, Google Drive. Evernote is really cool. And when I was in college, and I know that one of my former students who competed at Rice University, they used Evernote to file. And she actually sent me like the nested format that they use for their files and typed up a nice fancy thing on how to use that. So Evernote is a clipping and storage system for news articles. That's pretty cool. So there's also Extemp Engine. It's not very good, but it is free. It has a lot of bugs. You can download a lot of articles. Sometimes it's really slow to download, and I don't even know if they are updating or upkeeping it anymore. So that's an option. It's a Google Chrome attachment that you download, and then you can use it. And then there are a couple paid options, Extemp Genie, Extemp Dex, and then there's Prepped. And so those are all places where they have different packages that you can pay for. Extemp Genie does it by user, and they sell you licenses, and then each student that logs in creates their own license use, and then they can help contribute to the team files, organize information. Prepped and Extemp Genie are pretty much the same price, and they're pretty much interchangeable. They pull from the same articles and the same databases. They utilize a lot of the same filing systems. And so that's just an option if you have the money and want to purchase those. And like I said, I'm really considering this year not even buying one of those systems, because now that Keisha has said students can use the internet, there's no reason why they're at a tournament they can't just Google and pull articles. And then I'll just have to make sure that on my part, I'm doing a good job with my weekly news quizzes so that I know that they're reading and that they're consuming that information, so that we're not getting caught off guard by questions we don't know anything about when we go to tournaments.
Okay, let me ask a crazy question. From the small school's perspective, from the new coach perspective, just getting started, how can I approach this and pull this off in a way that, one, I can attract and get kids in the program in a meaningful way. Two, the administration smiles down upon me and beams with light and money because they think I'm the most genius person because the kids are engaged and doing cool things and representing the school well. And like three, P.S. the kids are like improving their outcomes in the process. Talk about that. Talk about like that Abilene perspective that you have.
Yeah. So when I worked at El Dorado and Abilene, they're a little bit smaller schools. They're still 4A, so they're kind of in the middle range, but definitely they're a lot heavier emphasis on acting. We had good theater programs at both places. A lot of students thought those events were a lot more attractive and a lot more fun. And so getting kids to be really into Extemp and to kind of have that support is a hard sell. And so I think, honestly, I wouldn't try as a new coach to have some big printed paper file or to order a bunch of magazines or to bog them down in a bunch of research. I would just work on picking basic questions. One thing that is a little different depending on the tournaments that you attend, the level of intricacy in the questions. Some of the tournaments are a little bit less complex. So like if I go to a smaller tournament, I might have more local issues or state-based issues as some of the questions. So I might hear things like, what can be done to improve school lunches? And that's going to be a question that's a little bit more simple and a little bit more direct. And so just depending where I'm at, my questions might change a little bit to be a little bit more easy, and they might be things kids are into and kind of care about. And so that's one way to kind of get them into it. But I think if I'm a new coach and I'm approaching Extemp and I don't have a whole lot of experience with it, I would not get bogged down in all of the, like, I've got to have this fancy file and this fancy system. I would probably just say, we're going to look at some questions today of things that are going on in the news. We might read a little bit, we might talk about it. You know, what news sources are fun to consume for you, what areas, you know, could we look into, and then just have them write questions using Google, because I think that's a lot simpler. One thing I can say in terms of like getting administrative support and parent support and getting kids invested in Extemp, I do a showcase every year for forensics before state, where we showcase our performers that are good. And the favorite performance every single year is the extempor. So I have the audience write questions, like political questions about things. We put them in a hat. My extempor comes out. They draw the questions. We read them out loud. They say which one they pick. We have them go to a desk at the back of the stage and they prep while other people are performing. And so the audience can watch them in the back corner preparing. And then after the next two performers, they get up, they walk to the front, they restate their question, and then they give the speech. And the audience, hands down, every year thinks that's the most impressive thing. Because how impressive is it for, you know, a 16-year-old to, you know, care a little bit about politics and to be able to analyze that and to show those skills off and give those speeches in such a limited amount of time, and when the audience made up the questions. So that's one thing I would do, and kids see that and they're impressed by it. And so that's an impressive way that you can kind of get people to buy into it too. And if you struggle with like coming up with extemp questions, I was trying to think, I have so many presentations on extemp, but I have, I want to think, one of these has, that one may not be the good one, but yeah, so you can order extemp questions from Extemp Relief. That's an organization here in Kansas that's run by a former forensics coach. You can go to Extemp Hub. There's some other places where you can go to. Extemp Central is great. I use that a lot. They've started updating that. They release a list of 10 weekly United States extemp questions and 10 international extemp questions, and we will utilize those a lot. So if you're a coach who ordered West Coast for debate, they have news views. They also have like a congressional/extemp research packet that you can buy. I don't know that I would buy it unless I just had extra money laying around, which most of us probably don't, but that's definitely an option. So there are a lot of places where you can kind of go to get some help with that. And if you're just really struggling, like, you know, there is a coach in this area who doesn't always like to host extemp because they're not comfortable writing the questions, but just reach out because the community is pretty great. Like, I'll help write questions for anyone who wants them anytime. I'll share my questions for my tournaments. So if you need any of those resources, you can always reach out to me. I'm happy to help and happy to share whatever I have.
And I was gonna say, I'll second that. I think I wrote questions for like 10 tournaments last year, and it was real easy for me because I just started writing tournaments. I host earlier in the year. I wrote a bunch of questions. I pass them on to the next person. I add a few each week to them. By the end of the year, you got a really nice set of questions to work from, and more than happy to share that. It's also like, I'll just say this from a classroom activity perspective. I love current events days in classes, and I'll just go to Google News and I'll start at the top, and I'll let, instead of me bringing what I want to talk about or what I'm thinking about or what's going around the school community, like, let's go to Google News and we're just going to go through and we'll start at the top and we'll scroll through and you know, we'll pick 5 to 10 things in a class period and we'll just talk about them. And Megan talked about framing questions, and a lot of times, you know, as you're reading the articles, it will create natural questions. What do you all think about this? Which side of this do you sit on? Where there's 3 articles that are all talking about this. They take different views. How do you feel about this? Which one's got the strong, you know, real easy discussion things that, like, simultaneously while doing the extemp thing, you're also just teaching them about the world and removing the bias by just letting the world come to them as it's happening, as opposed to presenting pre-done questions and that side of things.
Yeah, and I've been really fortunate at South because all of our history teachers do current events and require students to do them. And so students already come to me with like an expectation of learning about what's going on in the world and handling current events and analysis. And so they're already consuming some news. And I'm just going to increase that. And especially the ones that enjoy that, we're going to focus on finding ways to channel that into Extemp. Any other questions or comments, Mr. Harris?
Now I'm gonna one thank Megan real quickly, and then I'm gonna stop recording.